Hello and welcome everyone to the 7th panel at the Illusion Horror Con 2023. And it is, at least for me, a Sunday morning-ish. So perfect time to talk about horror podcasts and anything that you can do on a relaxing Sunday. And with me, I have Scott Dorward and T.A. Newman to give a bit more insight from a professional point of view. Us amateurs can maybe learn from them. But before we go into, Scott, would you mind give a brief introduction about yourself and why I invited you for this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you've got a better idea why you invited me than I have, but I'm always happy to talk. So yeah, I'm Scott. I write a bit of stuff for RPGs, and I guess more for the purposes of this podcast, I'm involved with this podcast. Yes, I'm a professional, damn it. For the purposes of this panel, I'm involved with a number of podcasts. I've been one of the hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias, along with Paul Fricker and Matt Sanderson, for just over 10 years now. Then I'm also involved with How We Roll. I've been a cast member there for, must be about 6 years now. And more recently, about 3 years ago, I became involved with Ain't Slayed Nobody and Grizzly Peaks Radio. So I'm a regular cast member on both of those. And I also do a lot of the editing and production work for the Good Friends of Jackson Lies, for How We Roll, and for Ain't Slayed.
Yeah, that reminds
me. Is it easier, Scott, to say what you're not involved with? These are the two podcasts I don't do in the
world. Newman, please give us an introduction of who you are.
My name is T.A. Newman, and I am Scott's biggest fan, as always. But I'm the host of the Miskatonic Playhouse, and we've only been around a year or two, so I think our insight into this panel is in that kind of startup phase. We're relatively established now, but I think there is a recognition, and I think we're proud to recognise that we are still relatively an early bird in this world of podcasts, and it's a difficult but brilliantly rewarding environment to be in. So yeah, I'm the host of the Playhouse, but my background, kind of coming into it, is I'm an actor. I was trained drama school in London, performed for many years for my sins before I realised that my family was going, "Where are you?" And then kind of moved into teaching acting and teaching theatre studies. So now I do voice work. Because it means I can work at home. But I also teach, and now I also host the Playhouse, which is a fantastic privilege. Yeah.
Fantastic. And maybe to set us off, I wanted to ask, can you give me an idea why you went into podcasting, or why did you start podcasting in the first place? Was there a motivation? I mean, Newman, you just mentioned maybe family matters and working from home is a good benefit, but maybe was there a need that you saw in the audio field or in the field that you wanted to join into?
Do you want to kick off? Because I'm still thinking about this.
I will kick off.
I can't remember.
It's more of a it's more of a continuation for me. I suppose when I kind of I don't like to think of it as stepped away from acting, but I suppose when I stepped away from touring, shall I say, because I was predominantly theatre performer. I did one or two screen things, but only the kind of things that my mum would keep on tape and show to her friends, rather than anything that I'd kind of go, "Hey, look at this." I did a fantastic, like, Oscar-winning performance in an episode of Doctors, or 2 episodes of Doctors once, which I think is up there with Laurence Olivier. Sorry, that's for our British daytime TV watchers. So I think when I kind of moved away from touring acting, I felt almost, and I'm sure lots of us have felt this in our time, I actually felt like there was a big creative kind of gap in my life, and I felt that my mood changed quite significantly. I was very happy, family and whatnot, and day job teaching acting. But in terms of me being a creative, I was desperate for something, and I kind of, obviously running games with my friends, pouring my heart into performing all of these NPCs and everything, as we do. And then I kind of fell into writing. I'd already been a writer, written some fiction previously that's been published, and I was in that place where I kind of there was a happy accident. There's a bit of a story on Facebook of all places where I was chatting with the Miskatonic repository community. And of all people, and he's chatting to me on Discord at the moment, of all people, Stu Sellens of the Host and Hostility fame, the Emmy award-winning Regency one-to-one scenario productions, we were chatting online in a group, and we were kind of saying, wouldn't it be great if there was a podcast, actual play of Miskatonic repository scenarios, because we were both writers within that community. And I kind of went, let's do it. And Stu went, okay. And I went, yeah. So I literally opened up like that second, that day, Discord server, didn't have a name for us, opened this up, did this, and we just put out a call and went, would anybody like to kind of join us on this endeavor? And we were very lucky that there was a group of individuals who, with a certain set of skills, we sound like the worst, like team of bank robbers ever. A certain set of individuals with a certain set of skills all came forward, and it formed the core hub of what the Miskatonic Playhouse is. There was, a day or two later, we were like, we need a name. I shouted out the Miskatonic Playhouse, and we went, that lands, that sounds really good. It fits with what we want. We want this kind of theatrical endeavor, and me, with my theatrical background, was kind of pushing for that. But we've got, there's amazing, Hedge, who's the fantastic backstage manager, but he does so much more. He's such a community-minded individual, and he's creating opportunities constantly to engage the community. Pete, our video editor, Cosmic, our sound editor, they do so much work that I don't even know about, and they are constantly doing stuff in the background. So, we were very lucky that we kind of came about through, I suppose, serendipity.
Fantastic. What about you, Scott? Back in the days when radio needed to be hand cranked to load.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it. So, going back to the dim and distant early days of podcasting, like 15, 16, 17 years ago, both Paul Fricker and I were fans of a podcast called Sons of Cryos, which was, I don't know if it was the first gaming podcast, but it was certainly one of the very early RPG podcasts. And we listened to it, and we'd often talk about it and how cool we thought it was. And we discussed a few times the idea of perhaps trying to do something a bit like it ourselves. And we had a failed start. We recorded a pilot with a friend of ours that didn't really go anywhere. And then we all got involved, Paul, Matt and myself, with Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, and started writing stuff for the system as well as working on the core book, and thought it might be nice to have a platform to promote some of this stuff. And so Paul resurrected the idea of doing a podcast, and we recorded a few episodes of The Good Friends under some trying technical conditions, sitting out in Paul's garden shed with some really crappy equipment. And if you ever listen back to those early episodes, you'll understand just how awful they sound. And we stumbled into it that way, and somehow we kept going, and we've, I guess, including special episodes and the like, recorded something like 320, 330 episodes since then.
Wow.
And during that time, we've learnt an awful lot about how to prepare for these podcasts, about how to get better equipment, what kind of equipment we needed, better environments for recording, how to edit and produce them so that they don't sound like they were recorded in a badger's arsehole. And they, I think they've got better since then. And then, I kind of got into the actual play stuff again by accident. It started out with Joe Trier inviting Paul and Mike Mason and me to join them for a guest recording of, what was it, Servants of the Lake on How We Roll. And then after that, Joe asked me to run my scenario Blackwater Creek for them, and I just sort of hung around after that. They asked me to run a campaign. I'm still running the same campaign 6 years later. Done a lot of one-shots and started running stuff for other games as well. For Enslaved Nobody. And yeah, it's just sort of snowballed from there.
Fantastic. Just a note to any viewers, if you have any questions to our guests, and please ask them in our YouTube channel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I wanted to follow up now a bit on this, because obviously we are in TTRPG games, and also with your podcast experience, there is a difference when you run a game for your friends, and there's a difference when you run it for an audience. What would you say are kind of common pain points or like issues when you prepare and run games for an audience and when you run it for your friends?
I think, and again, I just want to state here, Scott's been doing this for such a significant amount of time, and when we kind of look at stuff, as you do, you tend to look at other podcasts, what they're doing, how they're doing it. I will say something, and if Scott says something different, I'll go, oh yeah, no, what Scott said. Yeah, that's what I meant. No, I think the first thing that comes to mind, David, when you talk about that is pacing, and it's because of it's knowing about the product that you're putting out if you're doing it for an audio release. So obviously a game with your friends, I'm sure we've all been in the situation where we've kind of run a game and we've gone, God, look at the time, guys, let's just pause it there and we'll come back to it. And you've got the kind of the freedom to do that. Obviously, if it's a convention game, again, that's a different beast. But with a podcast, I think what we do at the Playhouse, we've got our different products. We've got our main stage, which can be a number of acts, as we call them, for a specific scenario. We've got our matinee, which goes out just as an audio rather than the video as well, and that usually goes out as a singular recording. So however long it is, it just goes out as a singular recording. I think we did a special with Viral because Alex Guillot ran it for us, and it was significant in terms of length. So we did it in eight acts. So knowing whether it's going to be a series of acts, we kind of go, right, well, as a listener, we're kind of looking at, at the hour mark, maybe just over, probably an hour, 15, hour 20 max for an act, for an episode. So when we're planning it, either as the keeper, whoever's going to be running the game is planning it as the keeper, they'll talk as well about what we're doing in terms of the narrative, talk about, with someone like Cosmic, who's here in the chat, which is amazing. Hey, Cosmic. And it's worth, having those conversations, because there's more than just the keeper that's creating this production. You've got to think about the editors in there. You've got to be on the same page. There's almost a playbook that you kind of work with. So it's really important to make sure that as you're telling the story, as you're pacing it as the keeper, you might want to build up to a moment to pause the end of the act, pause the end of the episode. You take a break. It might be that night that you actually record the next episode. But in terms of the release schedule, that is an episode, that is a chunk. So there is a production line, essentially a production quality to what you're planning in terms of pace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd agree with at least some of that, and my approach is a bit different in that I think I tend to do things in a more chaotic way, because that's just the way my brain works. I'm not an organized man. And what I tend to do is when I run stuff, even for actual plays, I take a much more improvisational approach. I tend to be a very reactive GM. I see what the players are doing, and I try to react to that and try to just use escalation and conflict to push things to dramatic points. And what I'm doing when I do that is looking for the kinds of things that Newman was talking about there, those cliffhanger points, or those big dramatic points, which would make good episode ends. And I'll tend to announce that during the recording, sort of, shall we end this episode of this session here? And that then creates that dramatic structure. But I don't plan it anywhere near as much as Newman does there. I just sort of see what happens.
Are you sure you're changing your mind, Newman?
No, I was just going to say, I would say that is a plan, but as we all say about plans, they do not survive contact with the enemy. So I can kind of plan and kind of go, right, in this scenario, wouldn't it be great if we got to this moment? And I think, Scott, when we ran Branches of Bone, because of the role play, because of the characters, and Scott played this wonderful kind of Viking seer well, actually it's out, so there's no spoilers there, but immediately drugged one of the NPCs, the chieftain's son, which led to a fantastic kind of subplot that kind of drifted into the background. But it's moments like that you can't plan for. So even though there is a bit of a plan, I think, Scott's talking about finding these escalation moments and moments to kind of recognize that kind of is it, because that's the fun of play, isn't it? That's the fun of what we're doing.
Yep.
And I think as well, one of the big differences, it comes from how you approach it as a player. And I'd say in a lot of cases that's more important than how the GM approaches it. Because with an actual play, as a player, you're trying to do your bit to make this as interesting as possible. And that often means, I mean, it's not just a question of how you portray your character and how you voice them and so on, but it's the dramatic decisions you make. So you might, if you were a player in a home game, you might think in terms of what's an optimal thing to do here, what will guarantee my characters survive, or what will help the other player characters in this situation. In an actual play, I'd like to think you're thinking, what will be fun to listen to at this point? Yeah, and very often that is not the optimal thing to do. Very often that is the exact opposite of the optimal thing to do. It's not that you want to play your character as an idiot, but you want to perhaps play up their faults and their weaknesses, all the bad decisions that characters in fiction make that feel realistic at the time. You really want to lean into those as a player and make sure they happen at the table. And that when other players do those with their characters, you bounce off those and you get that kind of dramatic escalation amongst the player characters that I was talking about as a GM as well. It really should be just a mess of bad things happening in interesting ways.
That is a 100% perfect summary of when you are keepering Scott. There is this idea, there is this aspect of kind of like strategic chaos. It's absolutely beautifully in line with the game, the scenario, the other players, but it does add this, and it's exactly what Scott's saying. It's an entertainment quality that as a listener you're kind of going, okay, this is what's going on here. And I love that idea, Scott, that I'm playing up the faults of my character. Because you're right. I think in a home game, you probably can be a lot more, I don't know, strategic, self-aware of your character, their needs, their wants, their desires. Whereas when you're thinking about people listening to the game, which is an actual play, but to a degree, it's a performance. There's performance aspects in there, so there is that listener to consider. I really love that, play up the faults of the character.
Yeah, I mean the way I'd explain it in more general terms is, if you think about, let's say you're watching some crime caper film where you've got a bunch of ragtag criminals who are trying to pull off a heist, and you want to see it all go wrong. The last thing you want to see on the screen is a bunch of consummate professionals doing everything right, talking through the plan to begin with, and then executing the plan flawlessly. That would be the most boring crime movie you could see as an audience member. I mean, if you were actually one of the people involved in that caper, that might be exactly what you want to happen, but this isn't real life, this is drama. And so, you want to perhaps play up the infighting between those characters. As the GM, you want to make sure that if they have planned everything carefully, that you throw in curveballs and make sure their plans go off the rails within the first 5 minutes. Because, again, for the audience, if they've listened to all that planning, they don't want to listen to it all again just executing. They want to hear those characters improvising, having to deal with the unexpected.
Yeah, I think
Drama
And
needs
I think that's
conflict.
probably more fun to play.
there's
Yeah.
also that level of Schadenfreude that listeners want to
Yeah.
experience. I want to see them fail. I want to see that happen.
Not even want to see them fail.
Yep.
Want to see them have to deal with
Consequences.
unexpected problems. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they'll fail in an entertaining way, or maybe they'll succeed against the odds and do something really clever, and that will also be entertaining. But it is just overcoming or failing in the face of that challenge.
So, what would you say makes a good horror TTRPG podcast? What are like key elements for it?
I think it's Scott. We talked earlier, didn't we, about having having a group of people together, especially if we're just listening to voices as well. Having that, I'm very aware that I sound probably to our friends over in America very stereotypically English, and I might be hard to differentiate from another stereotypically English person. This is why I'm good friends with my Scottish friend Hedge. There's a reality there, and I think having different voices, and of course we all actively search for diversity in our podcast, in our material, but I think a big part of making a good horror podcast is actually getting a bunch of people together who not just have their individual sounds, so it's easy to listen to and easy to recognize them, but they've got a good engagement, there's a good bounce off them, there's a good relationship. I suppose you could say that's true for any podcast, really, especially with the drama aspect or a live drama aspect. It's that improvisation, is it prepared or spontaneous improvisation? You need that relational kind of contract between them, where it's almost like playing the yes game, isn't it? You don't kind of stop anybody and go, no, let's not do that. It's this contract where you build on each other's characters that we all kind of do as we go forward. I think in horror, that yes game is probably even more important. And when I say the yes game, what I mean is there's a very simple, basic improvisational game that you play with children when you're teaching them about drama skills, which is yes and they just go in a kind of, this, yes and this, and you're teaching them to not stop the drama, you're teaching them to build. I think with horror, because and I know we've talked about this in other panels, but because of the atmospheric, because of the tension and suspense, because of the setting, the world that you're creating, this shared experience, there does need to be a lot of yes and if you can find the right people to share that experience, and we're very lucky, there's so many brilliant people within this community that do get involved in lots of the podcasts, you can build a really nice collaborative experience. I think that's absolutely at the core of building something as delicate as horror, because you pull the bottom Jenga piece out and the horror's ruined. You've got to build it together. A lot of metaphors there. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I think in general, working with creative people who aren't afraid to really throw themselves into the game makes a big difference. When I think about the comparatively few, I was about to say bad experiences, but not even bad experiences, just not great experiences I've had running games for actual plays. It has generally been with people who perhaps haven't quite grasped the drama aspect of it and are being reticent or playing carefully, or not even contradicting the others, but yeah, just not throwing themselves into it. And I think, working with people who can create compelling characters, bring them to life, and are willing to make them suffer is absolutely vital.
Yeah.
From a GM side of it, I don't know that I have any special tricks to offer there. It fundamentally isn't really any different from GMing a horror RPG under normal circumstances in terms of the actual GMing skills and techniques. You are very much just trying to bring a world to life with nothing more than your descriptions and your voice. And if you're used to doing that around a gaming table with your friends, really, that's exactly what you're going to be doing in an actual play podcast.
David, I think just reminded me that the original the question here is about the successful aspects to building a horror podcast. Is that right?
What makes a good horror podcast? Yeah.
So I was just thinking, there is, and the Illusion Con is is a really good example as well. And I ran a game yesterday that there's brilliant kind of communication, content warnings, discussion of X card, etc. Those kind of things, which are really important. I think it's when those things have been discussed and there is a comfortable. I think Lydia in the comments, hey Lydia, has put in there about chemistry, and I think that's what I was trying to say in a very long-winded way. Very long-winded way is chemistry, and I think that chemistry can come from. And we see it, I listened to Ain't Slayed, and it's brilliant. And one of the things I love about it is that you got people on there who've got great chemistry, and that's the thing. I listened to Scott. I listened to the Pretending to Be People guys, and I know you've done some work with those guys. They because they're friends as well as podcasters. You listen along, you laugh along. There's fantastic chemistry there, and it's because there's those recognizable people that we like. And I think in a podcast, it can be great when new people are coming in. There's new things, or there's new people keepering, etc., etc. But if there's a little bit of recognition of some of the people as well, you get an audience relationship with one or two of the players. Now, you might be listening to a horror podcast and going, "No, I'm not bothered about the players at all. I'm just there for the story," and that's absolutely fine, because again, I've done that myself. But I think perhaps in our community, a lot of people, and David, you were kind of saying this at this, scrolling through your phone earlier, looking at all the different podcasts and things you got on there, and scrolling with so many out there, it's quite, I think, nice and comforting that you can go to a podcast that you can go to a podcast where you recognize some of the people in there. There is a little bit of a constant. And when then you see them, like Scott said, sensitively, but they invest in playing a character. And that, I think that can be quite a rewarding part of a podcast, especially a horror podcast, because it's horror. And any comfort we can offer within horror or around horror is great, because then we can really go for the horror.
Yep.
Yep.
I think I want to.
Yeah, and sorry, no. I was Well, I was also going to say that another aspect of this is that the idea of a good horror podcast is clearly a very subjective thing. And there are very different things that people want from actual play podcasts that are completely incompatible. And you've got to accept the fact that whatever approach you take is going to appeal to some people and very much not appeal to others. And what I'm thinking of here primarily are two factors. One is the degree to which the podcast is produced. And by that I mean, some people want to listen to actual plays that feel like they're home games. They want to hear all the mechanical bits. They want to hear the out-of-character chatter. They want it to feel organic. Other people want to hear something that has been much more heavily edited, that has the out-of-character chatter removed, that has minimal use of the mechanics in there, that perhaps feels more like an audio drama. And I mean, both of those approaches are valid. But, if you make a podcast that is geared for one of those audiences, the other one won't like it, and vice versa. Similarly, how seriously you take the game. And sorry, that's probably a bad way of phrasing it. I guess how jokey you make the play. Because in a lot of podcasts, people will just make jokes the whole time. And if you've got genuinely funny people involved, then that can be a lot of fun to listen to. If you have people who aren't necessarily that funny, it can be excruciating. But if you enjoy that comedic approach, then something very light-hearted, even in a horror podcast, can work, because horror and comedy have always gone together.
Yep.
On the other hand, you might want to listen to something far more serious. And there certainly are podcasts out there where you'll hear a horror game and you won't hear any jokes in there. And that too is great. But I mean, certainly speaking to people who listen to a lot of actual play podcasts, those are very different audiences. You won't often find someone who likes the jokey podcast who listens to the more serious ones, and vice versa. So, I think a big part of that is deciding, what for you makes for a good horror podcast, and taking that approach and sticking to it.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before the stream a bit. Like, setting the tone properly for your target audience is, I think, a decision that one needs to make when creating their own podcast. And that, all valid points, and I think exactly that. You cannot make a funny, serious podcast that will be enjoyed by the whole audience, but you will have the subgroups that you perfectly flushed out there. But I want to come to actually a point, because I think that leads me to a question that why I wanted to bring up this topic at the convention is the community building aspect of this. I mean, when I was introduced to or reintroduced to kind of a bit TTRPG and listening to podcasts about horror actual plays, one of the first things that I ended up was at the Good Friends of Jackson Elias, and I started to listen to your guys' podcast. I found the Discord server, and suddenly I was back into games. I had, a whole bunch of people coming together, and all with the same mindset, which was fantastic. And I know that, for example, Michael Diamond and Mr. Spike have kind of spun off from that platform as well, creating the Old Wait podcast or Mr. Spike's Bedtime Stories. So there's a lot of kind of fluent development that happened, and one of the main reasons, I guess, was also the home confinement in the last couple of years that we all went under. What would you say is kind of, from your perspective, and Newman, you have a pretty new podcast. How would you see the development in the last couple of years, maybe due to the fact that everybody was at home? Did you find that there was a need for it? And
I feel that the pandemic that a lot of people were indoors, and a lot of people who us essentially, we used to meet up regularly and play in person. It did change the landscape quite significantly, and I think not only did it bring a lot of people to online gaming, probably a lot more people to online listening as well, because I often found that I was listening to podcasts if I couldn't meet up with my mates and play a game. So I'd end up listening to Quest and Chaos play Massive Nyarlathotep, because it was one of the first things that I Googled and found, which was actually really good fun. They did a good job of it. It was really, really good fun. Really lovely people over there. I think, that there was probably, and I don't have any data or statistics to back this up, so someone needs to post false news across this as I say this. There was probably quite a significant boom of people joining the online community, as well as, I would say, probably within a year or so of that, and people recognizing what they could do here. Probably a boom of people like the Playhouse, new podcasts coming online. So you have things like the Good Friends of Jackson Elias that have been around for a decade, and still kind of going strong and pumping out these brilliant things that are a hub, a pillar of our community. But then probably like the Playhouse, and I say probably, I'm aware of quite a few of them because they're good people and we talk to them, and they're good community members that have kind of put themselves forward. I think our experience is the Playhouse, as I mentioned earlier, from a happenstance conversation with Stu Sellens, we kind of pulled the trigger and the Playhouse was born. And that's not a metaphor. We actually pulled the trigger. That was our first sacrifice. And then But we were also in a lucky position. The Playhouse wouldn't be what it is, without the Miskatonic repository community. Why is that? It's because of what we were talking about earlier. We have a target audience. We're not opening our doors to every single aspect of the horror community. We'd love everybody to come and join in and be a part of us, and we'd love to do more. But in creating a podcast, our mission statement quite early on was that we wanted to have a positive impact on the community. We wanted to highlight and show off and plug and play community scenarios by community writers, these aspiring professional writers, so that people could see their work. And also because we recognize that as a GM, you might pick up a scenario. If I pick up something off my shelf here, and I've actually run this for the Playhouse, if I pick up Flesh Wounds and I go, well, how the hell am I going to bloody do this? I've got the book, but me being me, bloody actor once upon a time, I'm sitting down reading a book. Sometimes I find that difficult, and I do. So listening to it or watching it is really going to help me prep and plan. So we also created what we created as a tool. It's supposed to be a tool for the community. We know that we've got that kind of niche market, but what we've also done is now started creating other products. And I think doing that and having the support of people like Bridget Jeffries from Symphony Entertainment, who have been an amazing kind of ongoing, regardless of their ever-changing roles, and now brilliant work they're doing with Chaosium. Bridget's just a huge community ambassador in whatever hat she's wearing. And a fantastic role player and a fantastic producer and a fantastic podcaster themselves. So having someone, and there's lots of people like this within our community. We do see, and I think it's a part of the process. You will see people pop up and go, "Hey, yeah, we're doing this podcast, doing this and this and this," and then unfortunately you don't kind of hear from them again in that respect. But I think that's a natural cause of any creative endeavor. If someone was to tell me that they haven't started a scenario or started a story and then not finished it, I'm not convinced I would believe them. We've all probably started creative endeavors of different various sizes and gone, "Oh God, I can't bloody finish that. That's too much of a commitment, or it's not the right time, or it's not this." So I think the podcast that we're seeing, clearly there's an appetite for them, and clearly there's the creative input to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, and I will take every opportunity I can to say how amazing they are, the team that we have at the Playhouse and the success of the Playhouse, it isn't down to any one person. It's very much down to that you've got a bunch of people there with a set of skills, and they are all committed to the passion project that is the Playhouse. I think if it was one or two people, I'm not convinced the Playhouse would be as popular and as successful as it is, even within this kind of near 2-year gap or year and a half gap. It's come on leaps and bounds. We hit the ground running, pretty hard, and we've maintained a pretty significant production rate, and I can tell you that because we collect the editor's tears, Cosmic's tears, in a cup, and you can just see it rise as we go forward. But it wouldn't be what it is without that collective endeavor. So if you're out there and you're kind of on your own, my advice at this stage would be to actually reach out to other people within the community, because that shared support and that shared help is something that is going to really, really help in creating any kind of podcast.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what you were saying about the way the pandemic shaped podcasting, it was huge in a number of aspects, and some quite surprising ones. I think it was the spur, like you say, for a lot of people to start creating podcasts, not just because they had more time on their hands, but because there was this shift to remote working, and suddenly people had recording equipment in their homes that they could use for creating stuff like this, which they perhaps didn't have before, or at least not to the same degree, which suddenly made it possible for people to record stuff that sounded at least moderately professional. On the flip side, I spoke to a number of other podcasters about this, and certainly during those early days of the pandemic and the lockdown, for that first year, 18 months, I think most podcasts actually saw a decrease in downloads numbers. Yes, I mean, people were at home more, but I think they were watching more television and streaming services and so on. What my belief is, I don't know this for sure, is that an awful lot of people listen to podcasts while commuting. And if they weren't commuting, those listening figures were going down. And I mean, certainly with the good friends, we saw them go down by 25-30%. And I think that was fairly common amongst everyone else I spoke to. So it was a weird time in that respect. But yeah, I agree wholeheartedly that this community aspect of podcasting is vital. I don't think we would have got started as the good friends without the support of and the friendship of the people at the MU podcast, the Miskatonic University podcast, for example. And we've worked with people in any number of other podcasts since then, and made a bunch of lasting friendships, and it's been great. For people starting out now, I mean, I don't envy them. I don't think we could have got started with the good friends in the same way these days as we did 10 years ago. It's a very different landscape. When we started, there weren't many Call of Cthulhu podcasts. There weren't many gaming podcasts in general. But I think because of that boom during the pandemic, and also just in the run-up to them, where people were getting more familiar with podcasting and had access to better equipment at cheaper costs, yeah, a lot of people just thought, oh, I can do this, and did it. And I mean, that's led to a couple of things. One is, yes, I mean, it's become a very saturated field. But also, I think, as you were saying, Newman, there are a lot of failed podcasts out there, or at least a lot that have dwindled. And, I mean, I remember looking at an article, I think, that was published by Libsyn, podcast hosting service, where they were talking about how I think the vast majority of podcasts, like 90% of them, more than 90%, dwindle out before they hit their 5th episode. Right. So, yeah, I mean, persistence is a huge part there. There's also... You've got to be realistic, I think, about the fact that it's going to potentially take you quite a long time to find your audience. Not necessarily, but it can do. I mean, it depends how canny you are about marketing and networking and stuff like that. But yeah. I mean, it can take a long time to do so.
There's a target audience there as well, isn't there, Scott? It's kind of knowing the audience that you want to find. Is that something that you'd say is fair?
Absolutely.
Knowing the audience and ways of finding the audience, right?
Yeah, and the marketing and networking part is a big part of that. But I think what's more fundamental is deciding why you want to do a podcast. Because I mean, I hang around quite a lot on podcast communities, particularly on Reddit, but also on other social media. And I see an awful lot of people who think that podcasting is going to be a new career for them, or at least it's going to be a side hustle and they can make money out of it and so on. And I mean, honestly, I mean, you can do it. I mean, it's possible, but I think if you think it's guaranteed or it's going to be easy, you're delusional. It's a lot of work, and more importantly, I think these days a lot of luck, because it is such a saturated market. If you think you're going to create your new gaming podcast and is going to get hundreds of thousands of downloads, and you're going to get sponsorships and stuff like that, good luck. I mean, it might happen. It probably won't. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. If you're going to have fun doing it, and you're not going to lose huge amounts of money in the process, and it's going to bring you new friendships and a sense of satisfaction at creating this thing, then do it. Just be realistic about why you're doing it.
I think, Scott, that idea of, if someone's going out to create something where they want 100 million downloads and it's a new career, then that completely defines the product that you're creating. there's no way that the Miskatonic Playhouse that's aimed at community content and obviously some wider projects, there's no way that we started going, guys, this is our retirement plan. That's not what it is, because it's a passion project. Look, if I think I hope Scott would kind of agree with this, the idea that, you know, we have supporters, you know, and we're very honest about having our coffee fundraising page, because it keeps the lights on. You know, when you've got editors spending all their time editing, you've got keepers spending all their time planning games, you've got, you know, investing in new equipment, good equipment, which is not something we wanted to talk about as well. Having equipment, being able to, and digital equipment as well. You know, we would love to, I think everybody who does this and puts a significant amount of time into it, and, you know, would love to be in a position where they can reward the team with a bit of something, or at least, you know, reinvest in equipment or games or even books, because if you're going to run a game, you're going to have the game, you know. And we're very lucky that a lot of our community members, they kind of send us the game and say, have a look at this, could you run it, which is brilliant. But Scott said, you know, unless you're kind of saying, right, well, this is going to be the Call of Kim Kardashian Cthulhu podcast, where I've got a very specific target market and I've got a very specific product that's aimed at just selling. Not that I know anything about Kim Kardashian, sorry, Kim. But there is a reality there. If you're creating what we're creating, and what the community of gamers listen to and love and enjoy and go back for more, and like the good friends of Jackson Elias, listen for 10 plus years, it's not about creating something that you're going, well, this is the retirement plan. It's about creating something that you enjoy and people enjoy, and that there is a demand for that product, which will grow, and perhaps there will be a financial income. But in terms of I can't really see Scott's camera too well, so I don't know if he is in his mansion right now. Is that LA, Scott, or is that
yes,
Greek Islands?
So, yes, that well-known suburb of LA, Milton Keynes.
yeah. I think that is a realization. I think it's easy to get deluded in things, but you know, at the same time, these are wonderful passion projects that, and if they do generate some income, I think deep down we all know it's going to go back into the passion project, because it's what we love.
Yeah, I agree. Before we go into maybe also what is required to get started, I wanted to go over a couple of questions that I actually liked from the audience. When you do an actual play podcast, and Newman, you talked about this a bit earlier about kind of setting, you know, beats and kind of ideas that might or might not be fulfilled. But do you give stage directions to your players maybe before the game? Like, I want to see maybe, I mean, Cult has a mechanic for that, which is the dramatic hooks. Like, I want to see my character do this or be confronted with this. But are there any stage directions, or do you just, exactly as Scott earlier said, like you just play as you usually would and see what happens?
Scott, do you want to lead on this one?
Do you want to go first?
I've got an answer, but I think it's...
Well, if you got an answer, go for it, because I'm still thinking about that.
So, okay. Well, Scott was a part of one of my answers. I suppose there's two things here. When we're running our scenarios, when we are running, you know, what am I grabbing off the wall now? Here we go. It's one of Heinrich's. When we're running our kind of, you know, scenarios that people submit to us at the Playhouse, we've got their scenario. We are also very transparent about the fact that when we run a scenario, we absolutely want to show it in its best light. We're not looking, you know, we are, the Miskatonic Playhouse is not a place that you come to hear someone talk about the scenario and break it down pros and cons. We're not that kind of style of podcast. What we do is we run it, we play it, and we try and play it as positively and as fun as possible to give you the chance to go, right, I think I know how I could run it. So when we do that with our scenarios, there is no real communication about, hey, it'd be great if we could do this, Cosmic was joking in the chat earlier about when we ran the Dragon of Wantley, which was our first release. There's a huge significant plot that we just tracks completely missed. I would say that I was the player that was saying we desperately need to go to Moor Hall, but everybody else was convinced it was in a different direction. And we did. We just went in a different direction. And we still had really good fun with the scenario, and we still presented it in a really positive light. And it's still, it's done very well within the community. So when we do our scenarios and we run our games and we have our guests on, we don't tend to put in these, and it'd be great if this could happen and this and this and this and this. The exception to the rule, excuse me, the exception to the rule was when, and we've got season 3, which is going to drop very soon, actually, which is really exciting, is Cult and Culpability, which was our 3-season, long-running Regency Cthulhu podcast. The difference with that is, and I actually got asked this in one of the Meet the Cast things about how much do I speak to the players and what do I ask of them. I think because it was a campaign, and I was very aware that we were balancing a line there between we're playing this, this Regency original story, which is going to come out as a campaign book, but at the same time, it was a huge investment in terms of the drama within it. There was aspects of our audio drama in it. It wasn't an audio drama. It's an actual play podcast, but there were moments where I was very lucky. I had some wonderful people come on board to play some NPCs, like the wonderful Scott Dorward, like the wonderful Lynn Hardy, like the wonderful Mr. Howell from the Stars Are Right podcast. And they came and joined our main cast members. So with these brilliant kind of roleplay actors coming in and playing some of these characters, there were times where I was like, oh, it'd be great if you could kind of do this. The problem with that is, and I like to call the problem Mr. Dorward, is you get these wonderfully, as we talked about earlier, you get these wonderfully chaotic moments where, as I said, that it's completely in line with the game. But as Scott said earlier, that idea of playing the character's faults. So you get this kind of oh, it'd be great to explore this and great to explore this. But then they almost just became their own characters. In fact, they did become their own characters, and they got character sheets because they were so invested and involved in the drama. But yeah, I would say, in all transparency, once or twice I probably did go to someone like Phaedra from Stars of Right, who played Anastasia in the podcast, and say, Phaedra, what is it that you're looking to do so that I can prepare? So it wasn't necessarily me kind of saying, can you do this? It was more kind of saying, can you inform me as the keeper outside of the game some of the things that you want to chase down and you want to explore, so that I know I've got it sufficiently kind of prepared as and when it might come up. Because it was a family drama in the Regency world, I wanted the family to find their way through it. And I know that all scenarios, to a degree, I think I've heard Mike Mason say this, they all have kind of their bumper lanes at whatever gradient you are, so that they navigate through the scenario and they're not just going off to India or something. But it was important to me that I had the players going, this is something I'd really like to do. So it was almost like a reverse cult hook scenario where the player was coming to me and going, I'd really like to look at this. So that's my
2 cents.
Next extremely long-winded answer. Yeah.
Scott.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast in that, because as I think I hinted at before, I have a very different approach to doing this. And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. It's just different people work in different ways. When I think about times I prompted players, it's been in long-running campaigns, and it's been more along the lines of, we've been playing this for, X number of months or years in some cases. There's this little bit that your character was interested in before, but, as a player, it's been so long that you probably forgotten about that. Let me just remind you about that in case you want to bring it up again. And so that's really the majority of my out of character prompting. I do very little in the way of planning the sessions ahead of time with the players. I do very little actually in terms of planning sessions ahead of time, full stop. I'm very much an improviser. And this is one of the reasons why the vast majority of the games that I've run for actual plays have been things that I've written, because I feel much happier going off the rails with those. It's exactly what Newman was talking about there. If I'm running something that someone else has written, then I feel much more bound to present that in the best possible light and to try to reflect what the author intended. if it's something that I wrote, I mean, all that shit can go out the window, and I'll just make stuff up.
There's a freedom, isn't there? There's a freedom with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that means, so for example, there's this campaign that I ran for Ain't Slade Nobody for their Patreon called The Meat Trade, which is a 16-page published scenario in the World War Cthulhu London core book. And we played it over the course of something like 30 sessions. And that's because it just kept going off at tangents and doing stuff that wasn't in the scenario, and it became something very, very different, which I wouldn't necessarily have felt the freedom to do if it weren't something I'd written. But also, I think it was just because it was that very improvisational approach of let's see what the players do and just follow them and try to make that interesting. And I hope it worked. I mean, right down to, I mean, this goes right down to the way that, I mean, the majority of the games I've run for Ain't Slate, that's the one.
Got it here.
Yes.
Got it here. There you go.
But it also goes right down to the way that I was so proud of that one. It's out of the things that I've worked on, that was probably the one I was the happiest with. But yes, I mean, even the majority of the one-shots that I've run for Ain't Slade Nobody recently have all been improvs. We've started out with a loose idea. People have created characters that tie in with it, and we just sort of see where it goes. I've joked about it, but it's serious. Sometimes the first improv that I ran for them was this game called The Green Pumpkin, and we just decided to do it as almost as a joke improv, because one of the listeners on the Discord has suggested just doing an improv with no other prompt than the Green Pumpkin. And so I joked about it, but it was serious. I showed to the players that my notes for the scenario were just the sentences, there is a pumpkin. The pumpkin is green. And that was it. That was the scenario. And we just took it from there and saw what happened. So, yeah, I mean, I can plan sometimes, but it's not really the way my brain works. I find it much easier to make stuff up than to remember stuff.
Okay.
And reflect, react in the moment, isn't it? Responding to the building tension, the horror, the environment, everything.
Yeah.
But I would say that's what Scott is talking about there is really exciting as a keeper, and I think as a player as well, because it's such a unique, personalized experience, which is beautiful, and as Scott said, very kind of improvised. And again, as a podcast, if that's your product and if you have the ability to do that, that's amazing. But a lot of podcasts that we see, and I think this is what we were talking about in terms of the market and is there a place in the market, we see a lot of podcasts that take published scenarios and run them because it's published and it's there. So what Scott's talking about there, I mean, that's a fantastic product to have because it's original. And if you like original content and you can find something that, that's like Scott's talking about there, the Green Pumpkin, it's beautiful. It's lovely. I think that's where, Cult and Culpability was born from. It was born from this original idea. It's actually being written up now post the actual kind of production aspect. So it's almost in reverse, coming out as a campaign book. But we had so much fun at last year's UK Games Expo. When Cosmic, our lead sound engineer, sound editor, it's on one of our Fringe channels. Actually, it's going to be coming out soon. He ran we ran an entire game where he did it with Cthulhu cards, and he just basically went, "Oh yeah, here's the person, here's an object, here's a mystery," and it was like, "Okay, you go into a room, spot hidden, right? You find one of the cards comes out this," and also our characters as well. It was like, "Here's your random character, here's your random character," and that collective spontaneity and investment in improvisation was really good fun. Actually, listening back to it, he has done a fantastic job keeping that game, and the players in it have done a fantastic job. It's great fun. It's a very different listen to a published scenario, but it's really fun and exciting. I think that's a very good kind of niche in the market there, because as we said, what we tend to get is lots of the published scenarios being played out.
But I think that approach of playing published scenarios is also a very good one, because I was having this conversation with Cuppy Cup a little while back, who's the mastermind behind the Ain't Slayed Nobody podcast, and he was talking about wanting to do more published scenarios because there are an awful lot of people who, as you mentioned with the Miskatonic repository stuff, who listen to podcasts as an example of how a game should be run. And hearing those published scenarios run perhaps gives them more confidence, and or at least gives ideas as to how they might approach running it that they don't necessarily get from the text themselves. And I think that to some extent applies to just the game in general. That I've certainly seen any number of comments online about people who listen to actual play podcasts as a way of learning GM techniques or learning game mechanics, and just becoming more comfortable with role playing in general. And I mean, this kind of blows my mind because, I'm old. I grew up in the days before podcasting. I played my first RPG 40 years ago. So the idea that now you can watch videos or listen to these recordings as a way of getting familiar and learning what role playing is in the first place. Because if I think about it, I mean, in my day, you learned role playing by stumbling into an existing group and playing with them, or because someone got hold of a copy of Dungeons and Dragons or whatever and thought, "Oh, I'll run this." And so we were entirely dependent on what was in the book. That whole "what is role playing" section that was in there was absolutely vital. You internalized all that, and you looked at the examples of play. If there were any in the book, quite often there weren't, and thought, "Oh, okay, that's how I did it." And so as a result, you had this almost cargo cult approach to role playing, where everyone would sort of pick up different artifacts of how to run or play a game, and you'd end up with very different approaches. And if you went from one group to another, there'd be quite a culture shock and so on. And I think, podcasting and streaming and so on has completely transformed that. You no longer have to explain to people what a role-playing game is and how to pretend to be an elf or whatever. You can just sort of say, "Oh yeah, listen to this, watch this," it's
interesting, Scott. I think I'm probably a product of that. When I kind of came into role-playing, there was I was definitely someone who, especially if I was doing other systems that I wasn't confident with, I was definitely someone who would listen. I remember when I ran my first kind of Vampire the Masquerade game, I made sure I listened to, lots of those folk over, Jason Carl, those guys kind of running, Vampire the Masquerade, running it really well and listening to it. But also, as you say, you pick up tips and tricks and things. But I think that's definitely become a common feature, part of the diet of a tabletop role player, an online tabletop role player these days, where being able to listen to a game. I think if I was going to run one of the big campaigns, one of the Masks of Nyarlathotep or Orient or Time to Harvest or World War Cthulhu, I would do my absolute best to try and find something and listen to it first. And I think Cosmic talked about this earlier in the chat, actually, saying with dyslexia, he it's something that he really appreciates in terms of listening and watching to it. And I know I do as an absolute kind of kinesthetic learner, being able to listen and watch something, and selfishly as a time management thing. And I'm probably a product of the COVID numbers. When I'm driving, that's what I listen to. When I go to work, I've got my hours drive to work, hours drive back. I'm listening to podcasts.
I mean, the educational aspect of the community that has been created, the explosion of various podcasts, YouTube, Twitch, whatever streaming methods, I think is significant. And as you said, Newman, I myself, especially when it's like new systems, and I read the core book, or like I glance through it, I'm like, okay, I understand the mechanic, I understand how the game should work, but how does it actually work? So listening in, just to get also a feel, like how do others create the atmosphere? And I think that also, well, brings me to a question from Alice, from the audience. Because, Scott, you explained that you might go a bit longer than necessary in certain games, but on the other hand,
Just a bit.
do you have any, might not be a question for you then, Scott, but do you have any tips and tricks to keep scenes brief, but at the same time impactful for the audience?
Yeah, I think I better let Newman answer this one.
Well, I can give a tip, but it's in reflection of my lack of my ability. There's a bit of a running joke at the Playhouse that when we started doing Cult and Culpability, it took nearly 3 or 4 episodes to get to the town that they were supposed to be in, because we were establishing the Regency world and the manor house and travel, and because we were exploring the setting. And very lucky enough to be in one of the panels yesterday talking about setting and atmosphere and things. In hindsight, as my keeping has evolved and practice has developed, and it absolutely has as being a part of the Playhouse, which again is part of our kind of mission statement, is improving people's gaming, is I totally realized that it took like this huge amount of time to get there. I mean, we had a great time and there was lots of spooky stuff on the way, but in reality, if I'd thought about it in a different way, it could be, okay, 2 days have passed and those 2 episodes just wouldn't have existed. Am I glad they existed? Yeah, of course I am. But in reality, now when we play other games, especially when we're playing a scenario that we're fitting into a 4 or 5 acts, there are things where it's like, okay, you've got to get here, and it's no, that's not right. Actually, that's a lie. It's not you've got to get here. It's just an awareness, so that when you're telling the story, it's about that shared narrative, the beads up and down. Mm-hmm. If I think of Branches of Bone, the first one, the first act, it starts off with the raiding party in these little warships going to the island of Skorgabien. And as they're kind of going over, I'm getting flashbacks, and as they're kind of going over to the island, so I'm sure Scott is as well, as they're going over towards the island, we had a really cool sequence there where our steersman had some stuff go wrong. There was someone firing an arrow, there was this happening and this happening. It could be that you just start the campaign with your boats are pulled up on the island.
Yep.
I think that idea of, if you're looking at pacing, if you're looking at those things, it's maybe testing the waters with your players. If I'd kind of said about those boats and said, you're in these boats, what are you doing? If everybody just kind of said, yeah, we're just bunkering down, keeping safe until we get to the island, it might have been that we actually went past it and I just reacted and responded to my players in the moment and kind of sensed what part of the story they're interested in telling, rather than being selfish and kind of going, no, everybody give me 17 row rolls. Give me constitution rolls. Has anybody been sick? It's about kind of, responding and reacting, I think, to the players. And if we're creating a product for someone to listen to, we've got to be creating something that the players are enjoying.
There's another side to it as well, which is, it's easy, I think, to forget if you're a listener to these things, that actual play podcasts, on the whole, I mean, this probably doesn't apply quite so much to streams, but actual play podcasts tend to be quite heavily edited. Mm-hmm. So where you have scenes that don't work, narrative dead ends, bits of play that are perhaps a bit drawn out, you can fix a lot of that in the edit. You can tighten it up. You can remove whole scenes. You can remove lines of dialogue. You can remove chunks from a scene to tighten the pace up, keep it much more dynamic. And as a result, the end result when you're listening to it will sound a lot pacier, perhaps, than the game itself was when you recorded it. And that's ideal. And I think sometimes it is worth taking that more leisurely approach when you're recording it. So you've got that additional material to choose from. You can perhaps have a bit of out of character chatter and just sort of shore up certain aspects of it to make sure everyone's on the same page, and then just cut that stuff out as well. And I think that's actually probably something that's worth bearing in mind if you are one of these people who are listening to actual play podcasts as an example of how to be a GM or how to be a player, which is they're not always a great representation of what someone's home game is going to be like for that reason, because they are edited, and also because you're listening to people who are probably very experienced role players. In some cases, you're listening to people who are professional actors or improvisers or comedians, and I've seen this again on a number of discussion forums like Reddit, where people are comparing their own home games to what they've heard in actual plays, and frustrated that they're coming up short. And it's, well, no, don't be, because what you're listening to isn't a realistic representation of what a game is like. This is edited, produced. It's perhaps planned in a different way if you're Newman, or and as a result,
I like that.
this.
If you're Newman, obviously.
Yeah, wait, not a complete chaos gremlin like me, but yeah, what you're listening to, isn't going to sound like your home game. It's also not going to sound like the game we played when we sat down in front of our microphones, because we fixed all the bits that didn't work.
Do you know, I've just seen Stu post in the chat, which is exactly what I was thinking, and he's put the Mercer effect, as in Matt Mercer from Critical Role. I think that's a huge reality, isn't it? That lots of people, I think going off what Scott was saying, lots of people at home were kind of going, well, why doesn't my game sound like that? It's because they're, professional voice actors, all, working at the highest possible level, winning Grammys, winning all these kind of awards. They get together, they had a fantastic production team, but they did start as a home game, but it's a very unique group of people who then had that injection of what they were able to do in a huge fan base, and then their own studios, their own equipment, their own editing suites, their own, because of the success of what they were doing, they really rode that wave and created it themselves. Mm-hmm. But I think the Matt Mercer effect is for to have a GM who literally can create those incredible voices, and then think about your home game and go, well, why don't we sound like that? There's a reality there, isn't there? There's a significant reality. I'm sure if your day job isn't being a voice actor, it's very difficult to make your game sound like as if you've got a bunch of voice actors at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's any consolation to anyone who feels self-conscious about that, in the last couple of years on Ain't Slade, we've had a number of people who are involved with Dropout TV come on as guests on the show. I mean, the people who are professional improvisers, comedians, actors, They do this stuff for a living on a regular basis, and I mean, I have at times never felt more out of my depth as a role player than when playing with an entire table full of these people who can just act circles around me, and it's just trying to keep up to anything like their level is intimidating as fuck.
But it is a style of play. It's not the way to play.
Exactly.
It's very much a production value. So if you're at home in your home game and your keeper is they have their. I mean, I have a Sunday game which I'm playing in tonight, and my keeper is amazing. My keeper's wicked. They're Norwegian. They do kind of some voices, but it's always a variation of their own voice. Their style of keepering is fantastic, and I wouldn't have been playing in their home games for going on 2 years now on a Sunday night if it wasn't, because we're not a table that we sit around and we do the Matt Mercer effect. What we are is a bunch of people enjoying a game together and really enjoying each other's company and playing our characters. That is a very specific product, this idea of the voice actors. If you're in a fantastic position, and I know we have at the Playhouse been in a wonderful position with our guests that come on the show, but in reality that is because of the podcast and it's a production, and you're excited to be able to bring new things to your audience, as in guest stars, and possibly some of those voice actors that can create those things. At home, our home games that we play, they don't sound like that. They won't sound like that because we're human beings getting together to have a fun time. It shouldn't need to be a full acting experience. Although if you do get invited around to Matt Mercer's house to play, you should probably say yes.
But also, I think related to that, if you are starting to do your own actual play podcast, getting involved with them, I think it is worth coming to terms with what your strengths and weaknesses are, and learning those and learning how to play to them. Because I know, for example, that I think I'm a reasonably good role player in terms of the decisions I make at the table and an ability to embody a character. On the other hand, I have no capacity for character voices at all. I don't have any range there. I can do a few variants, but I cannot do other accents to save my life. To give you some example of how bad I am at accents, I'm Scottish and I sound like this. So, yeah. I've learned my limitations there, and I very rarely try stuff like that at the table because I know it doesn't tend to go well for me. So instead, I tend to try to lean into the things I know I can do well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. You don't have to be able to do it all.
Absolutely. I think that kind of... I just had a thought throughout the whole conversation, but like coming back to like how to keep scenes a bit shorter and kind of to have them impactful. We actually did on Illusion the Sovereign Sacrifice ran by Chris. And we started out actually to play as a home group. And after like 2-3 sessions, we were like, actually, that's a really fun scene. We want to put this on the stream. But then we consciously decided to not keep the first part of that kind of adventure as a stream, but we kept it as our character's backstory. And that basically allowed us to start the scenario with the constellation. We added a couple more players, but like we found out that the playing a game before, or 2 games, or I think we had 2 or 3 sessions beforehand, allowed us to create already kind of a grain in the player pool, and we had kind of this backstory that we could relate to and keep it kind of a secret idea from the listener, which made it also intriguing for during the play. Like, do you remember the scene on the boat? Oh, it was so dark down there. And however you describe it, you can describe it so vividly in collaboration with the others, and it doesn't take you much time to describe the scene because you know how it was, which also keeps the scenes shorter and keeps them interesting, because now the listener is like, well, what was there? How did this happen? And so you keep them engaged throughout that effect. And it actually turned out very fun because we often kind of flashed back to this, and we kept a scene very short, and it was very impactful to the other players who also didn't know what happened before. So that's maybe a good tip too. If you have something that takes a bit longer, do a little play before, maybe just 1 or 2 sessions, just to get some or all of the players together and establish a bit of connections that, you might miss in the beginning of a show, but if you have a time constraint, it might help you to run a scenario or a session much shorter than you thought it would be taking. That's just my observation that I recently noticed, and it was a fantastic revelation. And I think we're going to try to do that a bit more frequent, especially on longer, smaller mini campaigns or something. It does change kind of the way of interaction. And I think also what needs to be mentioned on top of all of this is most of the times the guests we have are hobbyists, as we discussed. They're not professionals. And obviously, like, we have a certain repertoire, and as Scott, you said, strengths and weaknesses need to be identified and should be identified. And I think that helps to kind of get together more naturally, and don't expect to be overwhelmed by the offers of podcasts that are out there, because yes, some of those are heavily supported by professionals on so many levels that your podcast might not come to that limit in many years. But again, it's also what your target audience is, right? Do you want to achieve the same thing, or do you want to just play with friends and open these games to the public to have multiple views on that scenario?
And also, I mean, along those lines, I think you should also bear in mind that you're going to learn a lot as you do it. That your early recordings, if you're starting out from scratch, are probably going to be things that you look back on in 5 years, if you're still doing it in 5 years, and think, "Oh, that." Why did I ever make that? Why is that still out there on the internet? Make it go away. And over time, you will develop more confidence. You'll develop more skills. You'll develop more technical know-how, and the product will just get better and better and better. And that's good, but it can also be very difficult and perhaps a bit embarrassing growing up in public like that.
Yeah,
that's a really lovely way to put it. And I think also that just if there are people out there, looking at creating new podcasts, or if there's people out there that have been doing it for a while, they'll probably be able to agree. What Scott was saying there about the technical know-how, I think some of that also comes with having equipment, which is not something when you start out that you might be able to just go out and go, right, well, I'll just chuck 100 quid at this and 100 quid at that, or whatever. Because we talked briefly about the kind of financial realities of it earlier, but I think that is something that can make a significant difference. And again, it depends on your target market. If you're aiming at people who you want them to listen to you, and you've got that really clear, crisp, well edited, because editing software costs money. The literal microphones cost money. The cage to put your children in so they don't distract you whilst you're doing it costs money. There's lots of
I thought a door
potential layouts. I went for the cage before I went for the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, but
priorities.
Yeah.
Actually, that brings me to a topic that that I wanted to talk about as well. Is the technical aspect. What are kind of some requirements or setup that you would recommend, or maybe say, if you want to start a podcast, start investing in this because it might help you along the run? I mean, we mentioned a bit of this, but maybe from your own experience, what would you have done differently, or what would you have shifted your focus initially, if you could have the opportunity?
Everything. I mean, there's so much that I've learned over the last 10 years. But also, I think just what's available now is so much better than it was when I started. I mean, for a start, one thing that's very different now than when I started out is that recording remotely has become pretty much the standard. Whereas when we started out, the Good Friends, we always did everything in person. We don't anymore. We record remotely now. And that, I mean, it swings and roundabouts. There's less of a social aspect to it now than there used to be, which perhaps changes the energy of the podcast slightly. But on the other hand, it makes it much easier to get a good quality recording out of it, because you don't have any crosstalk, or at least crosstalk is easy to edit and change. Everyone's recording in isolation, which means you end up with a bunch of different tracks that you can edit very, very easily. I think in general the cost of podcasting equipment is much lower now. If you're starting out doing your podcast, and you want to sound reasonable, there are some good options out there. I mean, we used to use a Yeti, a Snowball Yeti microphone for the good friends, which is, I think, an option that a lot of people still use. I would countenance some caution with them in that if you record in a place with a lot of traffic noise or with in a flight path or anything like that, Yetis are going to pick all of that up. They're incredibly sensitive and they will pick up a lot of background noise. But yeah, I mean, talk to your. Oh, have we just lost Newman there?
Oh, yeah.
We
lost Newman, but we gained Graeme, I think.
Graeme.
There you are.
I've killed
Hello,
him.
Graeme.
That was not.
Hey, how you doing?
That's
Sorry
not
about that.
how
I was at a
meant,
dentist
to
appointment
join.
this morning.
You drove Newman away. But yeah, I mean, there is certainly any number of good microphones out there. Talk to people who are recording podcasts about the more affordable ones. But for God's sake, don't use something like a USB headset or even worse, the built-in microphone on your computer, because that's going to sound awful. For editing software, I think a lot of people start out with Audacity because it's free, and it sort of does the job. But if you get the opportunity to move away from that at any stage, I wholeheartedly recommend it, because there are a few problems with Audacity. One is it does destructive editing, which means it edits the source files that you record, which makes undoing changes if you decide you want to do things differently down the line very, very difficult. And I mean, that certainly cost me a lot of time when I was starting out. I use Reaper now, which is fantastic. It's comparatively cheap. I mean, it's $60 for a license. And yeah, if once you get the hang of it, it will speed up your editing no end. And I just wholeheartedly recommend using a proper digital audio workstation for your editing if you can. Mm-hmm. And the little things like having good quality audio and editing it well will help you stand out in what we've said is a very saturated field.
Yeah. Graeme, welcome.
Hello. Yes.
I guess that brings us to another point: time zones and showing up, playing with people in different
How dare you?
of the world. No, it's great to have you. And we were just talking about to get started with podcasts. What is a good kind of recommendation and tips? Maybe you can just give a brief introduction of where you're all invested and why you might have some insight into this.
Well, we play with 8 Slades, and that's like all over the place these days.
Yes.
From the California all the way to sort of England and back. So yeah, we play across time zones there all the time, or used to, mostly. We do editing now, and there's always been a few people who've just turned up late and all that sort of thing. Always problems with scheduling and things like that, so it's not uncommon. So yeah. I mean, Rena used to live in Poland.
Poland, yeah.
And they always sort of like looked really tired when they dragged themselves onto the podcast as well. So there was that too. But yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for people getting started in podcasts? What kind of technical aspect they should kind of keep a lookout, or maybe also just from the organizational point?
It's all down to your players. If you want to record your podcast, and make sure your players are invested. Don't do anything too big as well. Start small. Start with like something like a one shot or something like that, and make sure your players are enjoying themselves all the way through. Nothing worse if someone gets bored halfway through a campaign, they have to drop out, and it completely ruins your idea of what you want to do.
Yeah.
So Make sure everyone's
Yes,
on the
yeah,
same
yes.
level as you, have excitement. And you can always tell the older podcasts, their main or original crew are usually their friends, and they tend to drop out when it comes to that, and more people come into the circle. It's always the way, because people get lives. These are fun, lovely things we do, but when it comes to life, people move on and stuff like that.
I was just about to say that's hugely important because it's the investment of people, but their time zone, their commitment, their life, it's all a part of the planning and making these things real. It can be a big thing.
Yeah, for sure. Other thing as well.
You cutting off there for me?
All right, yeah. Yeah, I can't hear you, Graeme.
Nope.
This is a live example.
Yep.
This is
I'm
why
back.
we edit podcasts.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Yes, you are.
It's all to do with it, like people's chops for improv as well. When you're a player and a keeper as well. If you want to do these things are kind of important, and it keeps the editing down. There's nothing worse than having like 4 hours and you get half an hour that's useful for the story, and everyone's just mucking about. No end. I know Scott's kind of a master at keeping that entertaining, but. Some people can find that a little bit frustrating. It's like, well, what happened to the actual plot, sort of thing. So you got to go back to the main road at some point in the story.
The secret is not to have a plot, Graeme.
Yeah,
Decide on the plot after the event.
that is very fair. Just 2 sticks to the ground, start and finish.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to say, another thing, sort of building on what Graeme was saying there about people coming and going, is if you're doing this long term and from the cross promotional aspects of it, you really want to look at trying to have guests on, and I think there's a lesson to be learned that approaching guests isn't as intimidating as it seems, even if you're... I think Newman and I were talking about this before we started. You mentioned it as well, David. I think this perception that if you've listened to people on a bunch of podcasts, that they're somehow on another level or unapproachable or whatever, and it's not. We're all just gamers. Yeah, if you want one of us to appear on your podcast, the worst we can do is say, no, sorry, we can't make it, we're a bit busy. But ping people on social media, see if they're interested. You might be surprised.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's a very small industry as well, and people love to get out and see people. So I mean, I'm surprised how well Newman's done with Playhouse. They've picked up a ton of great guests for cult and cultability. Jesus.
Yeah, it is a mouthful. Joe, Graeme, you're absolutely I think I echo both Graeme and Scott. Everybody that we've been in touch with, whether it's been Mike Mason, whether it's been Scott, whether it's been Lynn Hardy, whoever it's been that we've been in touch, they've been so generous. Either generous in saying, look, I can do a little bit, or yeah, I'd love to fully invest and be a part of this project. But I think, as Scott says, people are people, and there is a reality though. Every now and then I kind of Graeme will post that he's running a game or something like this in the new system, and I kind of go, oh, can I be a part of it, please? And I'm not going to lie, Graeme, I do get very excited about kind of going, oh, I get to be in one of Graeme's games. This is quite cool.
Jesus Christ!
I do, mate. I do. Yeah, you didn't know you had a fanboy, did you?
No.
But no, I think there is that really lovely reality that I think people are doing this because they love it. So if someone gets in touch with them, they'll probably be real with you because, as Graeme talked about earlier, people have got lives and there are considerations to make. But if people can make things work, they probably will.
Yeah, it's like goodwill of people as well. Most people want to try and help each other out. It's just one of these things. As long as you're not asking for the world and taking it all, people will be quite fair with you and quite happy to help you. And people enjoy people succeeding and watching people succeed as well.
And also networking, cross promotion is a big part of whatever it is people are doing. So, the fact that you're getting to appear on someone else's podcast may give you a chance to increase your own audience, and also, I mean, it's just fun to play games.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
I heard that's a fact. Yeah, that's why we're doing this, right?
Yeah, you forget it sometimes, don't you?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
With all the excitement, but alas, I had enough from Graeme. 10 minutes are more than I can handle. No, but we're reaching the end of this beautiful panel, and I want to thank all of you, even as short as you were on, for popping in and talking about podcasts on horror. And maybe as a final kind of feedback, do you want to maybe say what you're currently listening to, or what you personally like as a podcast at the moment, and a tip for anyone starting their new podcast? Not all at once.
I can jump in first. I've got some quick things to mind, if that helps. They'll be less embarrassing, so I'll say them quickly. The first one is not embarrassing at all. I actually, when I've had a really kind of full-on day at work, I actually really love listening to Pretending to Be People, because they are they're playing characters, they're themselves, but it's comedy, it's a big fun one. And I've kind of come onto that after finishing Huge Arcs with Ain't Slade, actually. The other podcast I'm listening to isn't actually a gaming podcast, but I find it thoroughly intriguing and good fuel fodder, is the Uncanny podcast, which is Danny Robbins's. I'm interviewing people who have had supernatural experiences. It's actually really, really good, the interview process, and he's got a skeptic and he's got a paranormal investigator that he kind of has as a big discussion process. It's really a well-produced BBC podcast, and it's good fuel, if nothing else. It's very exciting. My recommendation would be nothing to do with me. We've talked about some equipment today, and we've talked about some things. If people do have any questions about equipment, the person I go to, because they're in the know and they do this as a career as well, is Cosmic at the Miskatonic Playhouse. So you can jump in the Discord. We've got one of the channels is podcasting, where people drop in and ask questions. And I would say at the moment, with Black Friday sales on as well, that is something that I know Cosmic has been quite on it with, and kind of going, hey, look, there's sales on, equipment is expensive. Equipment is expensive. Have a quick look now. So if you wanted to ask Cosmic, who's in the chat now, but if you wanted to ask him anything, jump into the Miskatonic Playhouse Discord and find him and start asking him questions. Is what I do.
Fantastic. Scott, Graeme?
Yeah. I constantly feel guilty about the fact that I almost never listen to gaming podcasts. I've referred to myself as the Garth Marenghi of podcasting. I'm the only person you've met who has been on more podcasts than he's listened to.
It's because you're on them all.
Places. Yeah.
But the one podcast that I listen to more than any other is not a gaming podcast. The one that I've been listening to longest is The Bugle, which is a political satire comedy podcast that's been on in the UK for 16 or 17 years. And it was probably the one that got me more interested in podcasting than anything else. And I still listen to it on a weekly basis, and it's been like the one constant there. So I'm a terrible person to ask that question to. As far as my one tip is concerned, just to echo what we were talking about earlier, if you're going to do this because you think you're going to have fun with it. Try it out, experiment a bit, see whether you enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, there's nothing wrong with giving up on it. It's not for everyone. If you do enjoy it, persist with it. And persisting with it, as we said, beyond 5 episodes will probably put you in the top 90% of podcasts.
Very true.
Yeah. Graeme?
Just now I'm listening to the Apocalypse Players. They're pretty good. Don's always great. Sort of thing. They always have good guests on, Mr. Spike and so forth. So I've been kind of going through their back catalogue, because they've been kind of getting a lot of notoriety right now. They've been doing very well. And other than that, I've been listening to BBC's Innsmouth sort of series from the
Yeah.
start.
Oh,
Love
yeah,
math
yes.
through it all.
Yeah.
It's a great, lovely series. I'd love to get them in a game at one point. See if we
Oh,
can,
yeah, yeah.
can nab them. I've been bothering Cuff about that. See if we can push the envelope a little bit. But
Julian Simpson, the writer.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
yeah. So that would be fun to do. These are like lovely little dreams you have. It's like, oh, that'd be great to put together. But again, as you were saying earlier, I shoot him a DM on Twitter or something, see if he's interested. Why not? You can only say no or just ignore you. So
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know he got interviewed on, I think it was the Miskatonic University podcast. So
Oh, did he?
he's-
Excellent.
Yeah. So he is at least aware of Call
Approachable.
of Cthulhu as a thing.
Fair enough.
Any last tip for new podcasters, Graeme?
Yeah, I'd probably just say don't aim too high straight away. Don't try to make it a job. If you try to make it a job, it's just not going to be fun. Just keep it light and make sure that everyone's having fun and let things grow gradually and like naturally, and don't try and force things. That's the worst. Always just make sure you remember that you're not gonna. I don't think you're gonna make a lot of money doing this at any point unless you are very lucky and shoot to the stars and get to the top. But yeah, do it for the right reasons.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us to an end. Probably much more to discuss in this topic, but we've reached our end, and I'm running a game in the next slot. So I want to thank all of you guests, Graeme Patrick, Tia Newman, and Scott Dorward for this lovely discussion on a Sunday morning, and I hope you got some idea of what we could recommend for starting your own podcast. The next panel will be in about 4 hours, talking about the creating an immersive horror game world, tips and tricks for game masters, where we have the creators of the original Cult, Michael Petterson, Gunilla Jonsson, Graham Wamsley, and Petter Nalo, talking about fantastic horror world creation. So stay tuned for that, and all of you here at Illusion HorrorCon, a wonderful Sunday and a couple more games, and thank you all. See you soon.